Hello, this is DJohnson, and I am presenting my final project for ALY6110, August 2019. For this project, I used a data set from the Financial Services Consumer Complaint Database, which is available on data.gov. This data set contains consumer complaint data for the financial services industry collected by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. The purpose of this data is to protect consumers and companies from fraudulent activity. In this data set, we have over 1.22 million complaints, 26,000 companies, and it spans over the course of 7 years. Some of the goals that I had in mind for this project were to identify the companies that receive the most complaints and to learn how companies, consumers, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau utilize the consumer complaints database. Here is the data architecture that I had used. Of course, with the size of the file, it was too big to handle in Excel, so I had to get a little creative. So again, I had downloaded the file from data.gov. I brought it into Databricks, and then I brought it into Power BI. Expanding on this process, when I had received the file, I got it from data.gov as a .csv file. What I had in mind next was to put it into storage in Azure. I learned that that was a very complicated process. So in order to complete this project, I ended up using the Databricks Cloud Community. I created an account there, and then once I generated a live cluster, I was able to load the file into Databricks and then use Python to confirm schema and to map the data. And then from there, I was able to bring this file into Power BI through connecting it through Spark, and the CSV file was loaded into Power Query, and then from Power BI I was able to produce some data visualizations. Here's a snapshot of some of the work that I had did within Databricks using Python. So I had opened a cluster called My Cluster. It was active at the time, of course. And then within that cluster, I created a notebook called Complaint Data. And then using Python Spark, I had loaded the file. Again, it was a .csv file. And then set some options to infer schema, to set the first row as headers, and to separate the data, mapping it by separating it by comma. And then from there, I had loaded it within the data frame. Once I was finished mapping the data in Databricks, I had moved the file into Power BI. Databricks is built on Spark, so I was able to use a Spark connection to do that. And once it was in Power BI, I was able to make some data visualizations. Going back to some of the goals that I had, one of my first questions was to identify which companies people were filing the most complaints for. Here is a breakout of the top 10 companies that had received the most complaints during this 7-year span, and they had accounted for over 600,000 complaints, which was over 50% of the complaints in the total data set. So here we see that the top 3 companies that received the most complaints were actually from credit bureaus, and then we have some banks, and then Navient, and they are a financial aid provider. So a couple different companies here, and these round out the top 10. Now on to how are consumers filing complaints. Again, back to my goals. I also wanted to find out how companies, consumers, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau are using this platform. So we can see here that this is how consumers are using the platform. They're the ones who are filing the complaints. And this chart shows that the great majority of these complaints are filed through the web. Some are given through referrals, and some people still send it over. They call them in over the phone, or they fax them in, or send it through snail mail, which is incredible. Now, to look on to how the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is involved in this process. They are the ones who are collecting the data, of course, receiving the complaints from the consumers, and then sending out these complaints to the companies, which really kicks off this entire process. So I had put together this chart here, this table here, to see how long it took for the CFPB to collect the data, process it, and send it out to these companies. At the top, we see that Navient and the three credit bureaus usually had their complaint sent over to them within 2 days, and it took a little bit longer for them for the CFPB to get the complaints out to the banking industry. So I think that's an interesting point that they could use to improve. And on the right side here, we see the average of the days that it took for the CFPB to send out these complaints to companies, and this of course includes the entire data set. And in order to get that number, I had to go back into Python and make sure that my schema was correct. There were two date fields, one that had collected the date in which the file um, was sent in, and then there was another date for the when the complaint was sent out to the company. And so, with the schema correct set as a date for those two columns, I could go back into Power BI and then calculate the difference between the two in order to produce this average here. Lastly, I wanted to look at how companies are using this information. Again, they use this data to protect themselves from fraud as well. So I think this is pretty interesting. This breakout here, this pie chart shows us the end results, or the responses from the companies. The great majority of them were closed without an explanation. Some were closed without any payouts back to the consumers, and then we have a small portion that was in this like tan color here that was closed with monetary relief. Um, and then we have some that were closed just generally and then closed without any relief to the consumer at all. Um, when I had looked at this data and I had saw this pie chart, I was thinking about, what were some of the things that had went on in the past 7 years that had that would really cause a spike and um, be an explanation for why some of these are just straight up closed. And I recall about 2 years ago there was an Experian breach. Oh no, sorry, it was an Equifax breach. So going back to the chart where we had the top companies, we saw that I believe Equifax was number one. So I think that breach definitely had a big role to play in this here. In summary, again, going back to my goals, I wanted to find out who the top companies were receiving complaints, and then seeing how the three stakeholders, the consumer, the company, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, was involved in this process. In summary, I found that the three major credit bureaus were the companies that had received the most complaints. They were part of that top 10, of course. Next, I found that consumers are more likely to file a complaint online um, more than any other method. Then I also saw that the CFPB takes longer to file banking related complaints than credit or student loan related complaints. And then lastly, well over half of the complaints in this 7 year span were filed against the top 10 companies. Again, those banks, Navient, and the credit bureaus. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.